Where's your entourage?
Yeah. What was going on in there?
They were probably pre-taping a segment in the studio, but I don't know who the guest was. Oh, Jessica Alba.
Just there? No way. That's cool.
Does she want to talk about the convention? We could bump the professor out, right? Good morning. I'm Rick Folbaum with Atlanta News First. Thank you so much for joining us for this special coverage of the Democratic National Convention here on ANF Plus. This is a coverage we've been offering you throughout the convention. We did it during the Republican convention as well. So equal time for the Democrats who are getting set to wrap up with their night tonight. Kamala Harris, the big moment, accepting the presidential nomination tonight. She'll give her big speech, probably the biggest speech of her political career, without a doubt. And a lot of people, a lot of eyeballs will be watching, as they have been all week long. We've seen a stream of big-name Democrats who have taken to the podium each night and made the case for the Democratic ticket in the general election this November. It is an election season like none other, at least in my lifetime, where we have seen one of the major candidates drop out so soon before an election day, only to be replaced by someone who not only took over the top slot, but seems to have given new life to the ticket. As we now watch some of the polling showing that the Democrats with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are actually doing very, very well, much better than the Biden Harris ticket was. And so it's an interesting time. It's a historic time with an historic ticket. And we are glad to talk to you about it today. And we've got a special guest here to help us make sense of all of this. We're joined by Dr. Ben Taylor, who is a political science professor at Kennesaw State University here in Metro Atlanta. We are so glad to have you, Dr. Taylor. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Rick. I'm glad to be here.
So I mentioned that this is really a political season like none other that I can think of. How do you, from a historical perspective, how do you sort of size up, as we take a look at this sort of from 30,000 feet, how all of this has gone down?
Yeah, well, in some sense, it's sort of a revision to the way nominations used to go, in that, politicians would get their nominations through the convention itself, and that's very much the way Vice President Harris was able to get the nomination. That there were no primaries where she was on the ballot. It was Joe Biden and a few other candidates, but Joe Biden successfully won all the Democratic primaries. But when he withdraws from the race, the task then falls to the upcoming candidate, in this case Vice President Harris, to make the case to the delegates themselves, and she did that very successfully and very quickly. And so in some sense, that's sort of an interesting way, sort of allusion back to the way we used to do presidential politics in the United States. But so it is sort of new for us, as you pointed out a moment ago. But I think in some ways it's very much politics as every day goes in presidential elections. You see now that the convention is happening. She's the official nominee. They are trying to build to tonight's acceptance speech a crescendo of activity. The Democratic base seems to be very activated and very engaged, and that is the best thing they could possibly hope for at this point, because once this is over, it's a sprint to Election Day and really early voting, which starts in the middle of September in a lot of important states like Pennsylvania, and Georgia as well is also right behind that.
That's right. And we have some dates coming up where people can begin to request absentee ballots. Then the early voting process begins, and that will take place up until about a week before Election Day. So we really are sort of in the home stretch, just over 75 days or so, I guess, until Election Day. So let's talk about last night's convention and the events that took place last night. Of course, it was the star of the night was Tim Walz, who is a name that probably most people, at least here in this area, had not heard of until he was named to the ticket only about 2 weeks or so ago. But now all of a sudden he is the vice presidential nominee, and he's someone who I think Kamala Harris probably picked, and I'd love to get your take on this, because he can appeal to a certain type of voter, perhaps, that might not vote Democratic otherwise, might not vote for her otherwise. Talking about Midwesterners, talking about white men, talking about Second Amendment advocates, because he is an avid hunter and gun owner. He's also former military, so he really does bring a lot to the ticket that she alone as a presidential candidate doesn't, right?
That's absolutely true. And one of the things you want your vice presidential candidate to do, any presidential candidate selecting a vice presidential candidate, what they want to do is solidify, as you pointed out, some areas that the principal candidate themselves may not sort of speak to, whether it's culturally or demographically or even policy-wise. And I think you're correct to point out all of the ways in which Tim Walz does that. And importantly, it's not just that he is from the Midwest, from Minnesota, or that he's been a governor, so that's a different level of government. There's always this sort of push and pull where people who've been at the federal level for some time want to bring in a governor or someone at the state level or vice versa. It's also that when he was in Congress, in the early 2000s and into just until a few years ago when he ran for governor, he ran and won in a relatively conservative rural district in Minnesota. And so he has a track record of being able to attract these voters, and he did fairly well with them also running statewide in Minnesota, which is relatively at the presidential level a blue state, but there's a strong history of Republican victories at the state level in Minnesota, so it's a competitive state. And he was able to demonstrate his capacity with those voters. So I think from just sort of his electoral experience, he also brings sort of a track record of being able to win those voters over, and he's a fresh face at the national level. And I think that's really crucial in an election season where we have had, until the upheaval with the Democratic ticket, you had a rerun of 2020. Not only does the Democratic ticket have someone else at the top of the ticket, but they've got a 100% fresh face, much like the Republicans and J.D. Vance, in their vice presidential choice, and that's really crucial when voters seem to be getting tired of the same old, if you will, at the top of the ticket.
So how did he do last night?
I thought he did fairly well. The idea, sort of the main goal of any vice presidential speech is to energize the base and speak to the way that the principal candidate, the presidential candidate, is going to do their job and the vision that they have as a ticket for their eventual administration. And I think from an objective point of view, I think Tim Walz hit all the high points. If you were a Democrat, you could not be happier with his speech. If you were an independent, I think there was plenty of stuff in there for you. If you're a Republican, I think my sense of it is that he didn't make Republicans want to not listen, right? And I think that's really the needle to thread. I think he did that. You saw a very emotional scene where his son, who has some disabilities, was sort of very engaged and emotional, and that was a very moving moment. So you have the human element, you have the policy element, and I think as a vice presidential speech goes, it was exactly what you wanted. Democrats should be pleased with that.
And it was quick, wasn't it? I mean, I think that was another maybe one of the pluses, because some of these speeches, as we have seen, can go on and on and on. And in this case, he spoke for only about 15, 16 minutes.
Exactly. I think that's something that the Republican convention had a lot of. They had some fairly long speeches. And the first couple of nights of the Democratic convention, there were some overtime speeches as well. So I think they've been trying to cut that as just sort of a stage managing issue. And I think, again, though, the point that sort of gets to this is it's not just about stage management. It's about what are people going to pay attention to. And I think a shorter speech, as he did last night, gives people a better chance to really pay attention to what he actually said.
I'm very curious to talk to you about Geoff Duncan, because he, of course, is the former lieutenant governor here in Georgia, a Republican, who was invited to speak last night because he has come out adamantly against Donald Trump. It's not that he is turned into a Democrat, he says, but he has turned into a Republican who is willing to come out and talk about Donald Trump, because in his eyes, and I'm guessing in the eyes of other Republicans as well, Donald Trump doesn't represent the Republican Party of old. He doesn't represent a lot of the same ideals that a lot of people who grew up in the Republican Party and who watched President Reagan, for example, and the Bushes, some of those values that a lot of those people might have. And we have a little bit of a clip of what Lieutenant Governor Duncan had to say at the Democratic National Convention last night. Let's take a listen.
So let's get the hard part out of the way. I am a Republican. But tonight, I stand here as an American. An American that cares more about the future of this country than the future of Donald Trump.
How do you think, Professor?
So let's get the hard part out of the way.
How do you think that the Lieutenant Governor's comments are being received by Republicans?
Well, that's a really good question, and one of the things I thought of when I saw Geoff Duncan's speech last night was the increasing tradition of Georgia elected officials or former elected officials to give speeches at the opposing parties' convention. Zell Miller did this famously in '04 for George W. Bush, so Geoff Duncan here he was a Democrat giving a speech at a Republican convention. Geoff Duncan's doing the opposite,
returning the favor.
Exactly, and so I think in some sense, Geoff Duncan's an interesting case. He was a statewide elected official, but he did not run for re-election, so we don't know how this particular message would have been received by voters for him particularly. But importantly, he was a well-respected lieutenant governor, and he's been involved in Republican politics for some time. So he certainly is sort of giving voice to what must be some segment of the sort of identified Republican population in the United States. The extent to which Republican voters are going to pay attention or sort of behave in concert with his comments, really it sort of gets to the point of he's giving them permission, right? You have high-level elected officials who come out and say, this person of my own party is not the person who deserves this job. That gives voters who may be on the fence or otherwise undecided permission to think about voting for someone of a different party. And that's an important aspect of American political behavior and political psychology. And I think Geoff Duncan sort of gave them that permission last night, but we'll see how many voters sort of go in that direction. It's an open question.
Okay, I want you to stand by, please, because we have our reporter, our political correspondent from Atlanta News First, Doug Reardon, who has been in Chicago all week. He, of course, was in Milwaukee for the Republican convention. He's in Chicago for the Democrats, and he filed this report from last night.
Tim Walz comes from an unconventional, maybe even an unusual background for politics, and you have to figure that is one of the reasons why Vice President Kamala Harris picked him to be her running mate. People here at the convention that we've talked to view him with a one-of-us mentality, and that was really the central theme of his speech. Walz was once a high school teacher and a state championship football coach, a 24-year veteran of the Army National Guard, and a member of Congress before being elected governor of Minnesota. He called the VP nomination the honor of his life. He kind of had double duty with his speech. First, he had to introduce himself to a lot of voters, even Democrats. For people not paying attention, Walz was relatively unknown until his selection as Harris's running mate. He also had to, at the same time, look ahead and continue painting that positive vision for the future that has been the central theme of this convention. Another reason Harris presumably picked Walz was that he was an extremely effective messenger on her behalf. He was the first one to coin the Trump-Vance campaign as weird, and he broke that out again during his speech. From the United Center, Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
And Doug joins us live now from Chicago.
Tim Walz comes from an unconventional, maybe even an unusual background for politics, and you have to figure that is one of the reasons why Vice President Kamala Harris picked him to be her running mate. People here at the convention that we've talked to.
And Doug joins us live now from Chicago. Doug, thanks very much. Great to talk to you. Tell us what it was like to be in the hall last night during Tim Walz's speech.
It was by far, Rick, the most energetic night of the convention, and I say that with absolute certainty because as we go out of the convention hall every night, we try to talk to some folks.
I think we lost Doug's microphone for a minute. We'll try to sort that out. Thankfully, we're still here with Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University here. Professor, we just heard from Doug that it was the most energetic night. We also heard last night from former President Bill Clinton. Nancy Pelosi spoke. There were a number of celebrities who spoke. When you think about sort of the overall feeling and tone of this convention compared to the Republican convention in Milwaukee, how would you compare the two?
Well, I will say that one of the most interesting parts about the Republican convention was the conspicuous lack of former important elected Republicans. President Bush did not go to the Republican convention. Dick Cheney was not at the Republican convention. Many Republican senators, both sitting and former, were not there. So there was a sense of unity at the Republican convention, but it was unity in the sense that these were the people who really wanted Donald Trump to be at the top of the ticket, and they were excited about it. But that left out a big portion of the larger Republican sort of pantheon, if you will, that are currently in American politics. On the other side, the Democratic Party seems to be very, very unified behind the Harris-Walz ticket. And when it comes to conventions, that's really what you want. You want to generate enthusiasm amongst the base. You want to give people excitement. You want to show independent and moderate voters who are just now tuning in the kind of activity and engagement that your party has. And then you really want to bring together all of the shining lights of your party, past, present, and future. This is a good opportunity to showcase new candidates or new political talent for the future. And I think the Democratic convention so far has done that fairly expertly. And the Republican convention, you know, they were excited about President Trump, but there were certainly noticeable missing figures and a little less enthusiasm, quite honestly.
Why do you think that is? I mean, and because I noticed the same thing. I mean, traditionally, you bring out sort of the old standard bearers who come out and wrap their arms around the new standard bearers. So you would have thought that Republican former presidents and former presidential candidates like Mitt Romney, for example, would have been given high-profile speaking slots at the Republican convention, like the Democrats did with their, former standard bearers. Is this sort of a sign that, that maybe like Geoff Duncan was talking about last night, that Donald Trump, in the eyes of a lot of Republicans, does not represent the brand of republicanism that we've grown accustomed to?
I think that's one fair assessment. And the other thing is just that the Republican Party is changing. Donald Trump is a 3-time running nominee, and so the party is evolving to reflect more of him and his policy points of view and the people who support those perspectives, which, again, if you go back to 2016, there was a lot of dissension in Republicans about the policy positions that Trump had and wanted to go to. So I think the Democrats have done a really effective job in a situation that could have been rife with chaos. They have done a very, very effective job at the vice president gathering the delegates and getting them behind her. And then, of course, the delegates themselves getting excited about the ticket, the vice presidential choice, and then the other members of the Democratic Party, who some of whom could have had ambitions themselves, they have gotten behind Vice President Harris because they realize that she's their best chance at victory in 2024. And so they're coalescing behind her, as political parties do behind their standard bearer. And they're doing it in a very effective way, and in a way that showcases both the type of campaign they want to run, that they're trying to run. You heard Vice Presidential candidate Walz and Governor Walz talk last night about that they're running a campaign of joy, and I think that they're exemplifying that. It's up to voters to decide if that's something that they're interested in. And then, and I think, too, it sort of gives you an idea about the fact that the Democratic Party, if they were to be elected, there would be more unity in the Democratic Party than potentially the Republican Party. But my sense is that if Donald Trump were to win re-election, that I think that the Republican Party would fall in line.
Let's go back to Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon.
Tim Walz was the star of last night's programming at Day 3 of the Democratic National Convention. He was relatively unknown to a lot of voters outside of his home state of Minnesota, but the point of last night's speech was kind of double duty. He had to introduce himself to a lot of people who did not know his name before he was selected as Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate, and he also had to continue that positive messaging that was really the reason he was picked for this job in the first place. Walz is very appealing to a lot of people, again, who may not have known him before he entered this race. He was a teacher for a long time. He was a state championship winning football coach. In fact, they brought out last night some of his players to introduce him on the stage, and Walz kept it short. He said it was the honor of his life to be chosen as the vice presidential nominee, and he continued that positive vision. And we were walking out with a lot of people from that convention hall, and they were very enthusiastic about his chances as a vice presidential candidate. They liked that he was filling some of the gaps that Harris could not in her campaign, that maybe she was more of an establishment candidate, having served 4 years as the vice president, and he was a relative national political newcomer. That was something that appealed to a lot of people. They talked about Walz pushing people out of snowbanks in his home state of Minnesota, stopping to have beers with people on the campaign trail when he was running for Congress and governor. This is the type of person that people can relate to, and that is what people vote for when they are looking at presidential tickets. Tonight, Vice President Kamala Harris will take the stage to officially accept her party party's nomination, and we will certainly be anticipatory of what she has to say in one of the biggest speeches of her political career. From Chicago, Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
All right, Doug's filing a story for us. Doug, are you able to hear me as we talk live now? Can you hear me, Doug? All right.
Dude, I'm not dialed in.
Yeah, we'll try to sort that out again with Doug. Again, we're joined by Dr. Ben Taylor, who is a professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. We heard a little recap of what happened last night, and Doug sort of teeing up tonight and the speech from the candidate herself, Kamala Harris. Let's talk about that a little bit. Of course, this is going to be the crowning moment of the convention, of any convention, when the party's presidential nominee officially accepts the nomination. Of course, it's followed by the balloon drop and everybody coming out on stage and hugging. We've seen this over the years at other political conventions. Talk to us about the goals that Kamala Harris and her campaign have going into this speech tonight.
Well, one of the things the Harris campaign has been trying to do, and you've seen it a bit in their paid media and their campaign commercials in the last few weeks, they're trying to frame Kamala Harris as a person, middle-class background, sort of building her way up through the political system, being a DA in San Francisco and a state's attorney general in California, to finally being a U.S. senator and now vice president. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of biography and background, again, to reframe her and her candidacy, and then a little bit about her vision of the future. I think one of the things that is very important that sometimes gets lost is that political scientists like me are members of the media who are very involved and very interested in politics and campaigns and watch it all the time. We want to hear candidates get very specific. We want to hear them talk about policy details and nuts and bolts of what they would do in their first 100 days as president. But at a convention speech, that's really not the goal. There may be some discussion of policy in a broad sort of 30,000-foot way, but really it's going to be soaring ideas about her vision of the future and the way the Harris-Walz administration would operate. I think, again, you're going to come back to this theme of joy, and freedom is something we've heard a lot about as well. Sort of very broad, big themes that are very sort of patriotic in a sense, but also give people a sense of hope for the future. And so my guess would be it's going to be a lot of personal biography and framing for herself, some vision of the future, and then, of course, you can't do this speech without talking about your opponent. And so there will be some framing of Donald Trump as well. Sort of you've seen a little bit of it already, sort of the past versus the future. Sort of arguments that the Trump administration would bring chaos and things like that. So I expect to hear some of that rhetoric as well. But on balance, I would guess it's going to be very positive and very future and forward looking.
It's interesting. This is someone who has been the vice president for 3.5+ years. Although I think that for a lot of people, even her supporters, this is going to be really their first chance to really learn a lot about her. She's someone who has been in the public eye and yet is not very publicly well known. Would you agree with that?
I think that's absolutely true. Vice president, or being the vice president, is really well known in Washington as basically the worst job, because you are part of the administration, you are on a presidential ticket, people know your name probably, but they don't really know you and they don't really know what you do. And in fact, much of the time, vice presidents don't do much at all.
Right.
And so it's sort of a blessing and a curse kind of job. And so this is certainly an opportunity for her to reintroduce herself to the American public. And the thing about politicians, which makes them different than other types of things that we package in a way like products or like, Lysol disinfectant, is that, they are a product in a sense, but rather than sort of having an impression and it sticking with us, politicians can continually reinvent themselves and they can continually reintroduce themselves to the public. And so I think that's something that Vice President Harris is going to want to do, reintroduce herself, reframe herself, her biography, her candidacy for the coming presidential campaign, because right now, we're at the end of August, we're coming up to Labor Day. This is when people really start to pay attention, traditionally, and of course because we have voting coming up as well, with early voting and early absentee.
One of the things that is obvious just by sort of looking at her on the screen is that we've never had a presidential candidate like this before. She's only the second woman to be at the top of a major party ticket. She's the first woman of color to be in this position as well. I wonder how much you think that should be a part of the messaging tonight, or if it's just sort of so obvious that it doesn't even need to be spoken about?
Well, that's a great question, and that really is part of the political skill that Vice President Harris has to bring to this address, and really her entire candidacy. You can think of a couple of examples, for instance, President Obama, and of course, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and of course, the convention so far. There has been some attention given to the historical nature of her candidacy. Hillary Clinton, in her speech, talked about the 66 million cracks in the glass ceiling, and finally we'll break through this year. And of course, President Obama talked a bit about it. But if you think back to 2008 and 2012, the Obama campaign went to some lengths that President Obama, candidate Obama in 2008 and President Obama in 2012, he himself did not really lean into the historical nature of his presidency. His surrogates did, and certainly I think, as you point out, people cannot see, obviously, that Vice President Harris is a woman and a woman of color at that. And so I think there's some softness they have to deal with this a little bit because, again, I think she, by her very existence, represents that in a way where she doesn't need to talk about it, but certainly people around the campaign and voters obviously see it as well. So it's obviously very important, but I don't know that she's going to give it a lot of attention tonight or throughout the campaign overall.
I want to wrap up by asking you about Georgia as we come out of this convention tonight and head towards the finish line with this election coming up so quickly. Georgia, according to polls, Georgia had been firmly in the Republican camp while the race was between President Trump and former President Trump and President Biden. But since the Democrats made the switch at the top of the ticket, polling has shown that Vice President Harris has made up some ground, that the Republicans may still have an advantage, but that it's closer than it was. I wonder what you think we have in store for us here in Georgia over these next 70-plus days, the way that the campaigns are going to focus on Georgia, and how important winning Georgia is to winning the White House.
Well, I think it's a very crucial state, and I think that there is no doubt it's going to be extremely close in Georgia and probably nationally. It's going to be a 50-50 race as we go to Election Day. And so, and the reason I think that you've seen the shift in polls from the Biden at the top of the ticket to Harris at the top of the ticket is really just enthusiasm. Democrats now have a reason to get excited and enthusiastic, and of course that's drawing attention to independents and moderates who perhaps didn't want to vote for President Trump but could not justify a vote for President Biden, and now they've got a viable alternative, and I think that's why you've seen the shift. It's going to be very close, and if you've already noticed, I'm sure we've all noticed, the inundation of campaign ads. Every single ad, it seems like, is a Trump or a Harris ad on television, and so and online for that matter. And I don't think that's going to change. And so we're going to be blanketed with advertisements. If you like political ads, it's going to be a great time. If you do not like political ads, I apologize in advance. But anyway, the bottom line is that it's going to be extremely close. It's going to be about turnout. Can Democratic enthusiasm get the kind of turnout that they need to bring over those moderate independent voters as well? And the real question that I have right now for the Republican side is, what is their turnout mechanism looking like? There are reports that they've sort of given that over to some third-party groups, and so the Democratic Party is very much in control of their own turnout stuff, along with the Harris campaign. So we'll have to see if the Republicans can get turnout from their base voters as well. That's the big question. It's going to be a turnout election.
Wow, great stuff. Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. I feel like I've sat in on one of your classes, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for tuning in to ANF Plus for our special coverage of the Democratic National Convention. You can trust and count on us for fair and balanced coverage of both campaigns as we head towards the election coming up in November. Keep it right here on ANF Plus, and you can watch our coverage on Atlanta News First. I'm Rick Folbaum in Atlanta. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.